Let's travel back in time for a moment. Now I'm going to tell you a story. Quietly, calmly, just listen. This is a story about what our land was like before that great upheaval that forever changed the face of Russia. Picture the end of the 12th century. The world is completely different, yet at the same time, surprisingly familiar. Close your eyes and try to imagine Russes of those times. It's not a unified state as we are used to thinking, but rather a patchwork quilt of many principalities, each with its own character, its own traditions, its own peculiarities. And the people who lived there were very diverse, not only in character but even in appearance. You know, modern genetics has revealed amazing things to us about our ancestors. It turns out that even then, long before the Mongol invasion, a true mosaic of peoples lived in the Russian lands. Slavs, of course, formed the foundation, but what different Slavs they were. In the north, in the lands where Novgorod and Pskov are now, lived the descendants of the Ilmen Slavs, but they had long since mixed with the local Finno-Ugric tribes. Imagine, where the ancient city of Novgorod now stands, the Chud, Ves, and Meria once lived. These names sound almost like incantations, don't they? And the Slavs didn't just push them out, they intermarried with them, took their daughters as wives, learned their crafts, and adopted their knowledge of the local nature. A little to the south, in the lands of the Krivichi, modern-day Smolensk, Polotsk, and parts of Pskov, the picture was similar, yet different. The Krivichi were perhaps the most warlike among the northern Slavs. They were the first of the Slavs to reach the upper reaches of the Volga and Dnieper, the first to encounter the Varangians. And even then, not only Slavic blood flowed in their veins. And what was happening in the central lands? The Vyatichi, proud and independent, settled along the Oka River and its tributaries. They resisted Christianization longer than anyone else, preserving ancient customs for the longest time. And among them, too, there were many mixed families, Slavic Baltic, Slavic Finnic. But the most interesting things were happening in the south. There, in the lands of the Polans, Severians, and Drevlians, the breath of the Great Steppe was constantly felt. The Polovtsians, Pechenegs, and Torks. These peoples didn't just wage war with the Russian princes. There was constant trade between them, marriages were arranged, and cultural exchange took place. Remember the Bylina about Ilya Muromets? It contains amazing details that show how closely the fates of the steppe peoples and the Rus were intertwined even in the pre-Mongol period. A bogatyr could be a Slav or a Polovtsian. The main thing was that he defended the Russian land. The cities of that era were true melting pots. Kiev in the 12th century. Imagine that splendor. Ships of Byzantine merchants sailed up the Dnieper, Novgorod Ushkuiniks came down from the north, and Polish and Hungarian traders arrived from the west, and caravans with eastern goods came from the steppe. And all these people didn't just trade, they settled in the cities, married, and started families. A Kievan merchant might take the daughter of a Bulgar trader as his wife, and she would bear children who spoke several languages and felt at home in both a Slavic terem and a steppe tent. In Kiev itself, according to chronicles and archaeological finds, there were several districts where foreigners lived in compact communities. There was a Jewish quarter, an Armenian one, and even a Khazar one. But the boundaries between them were not rigid. People moved freely from one community to another, especially through marriage. Novgorod of that time was even more amazing. This northern trading giant connected Ruses with Western Europe and Scandinavia. Ships carrying furs, honey, and wax sailed along the Volkhov River and out to sea. And they brought back silver, fabrics, jewelry, and books. The freedom of Novgorod was not just a political system, it was a special way of life. Imagine the Veche Square, where hundreds of men gathered, bearded merchants in expensive furs, artisans in leather aprons, young druzhiniks with swords at their belts. And all of them had the right to vote. Everyone could influence decisions concerning their native city. This democratic tradition, by the way, also had its genetic roots. The northern Slavs had long lived in tribal communities where decisions were made collectively. The Finno-Ugric tribes also knew similar forms of self-government. As these traditions mixed, they created the very freedom of Novgorod that so astonished foreign guests. But let's get back to the people. What did they look like, our ancestors of the 12th century? Anthropologists today can reconstruct their appearance quite accurately from skulls found in ancient burials. Even then, the North Russian type was different from the South Russian one. In the north, people were more often fair-haired, light-eyed, with narrow faces and straight noses. This was the result of the mixing of Slavs with Balts and Finno-Ugrians, who themselves were quite fair. In the south, the picture was more varied. Both light and dark types were found there. Moreover, dark features appeared not only from mixing with the steppe peoples, but also from contacts with Balkan peoples and Byzantine Greeks, who constantly came to Rus' for trade and church matters. Interestingly, regional peculiarities that we can still observe today already existed back then. The people of Pskov were different from the people of Novgorod, and the people of Ryazan were different from Muscovites, although Moscow as a large city did not yet exist. The situation in the Galician-Volhynian land was particularly interesting. These western principalities were at a crossroads of cultures, Slavic, Baltic, and Romance. They were ruled by princes who easily communicated with Hungarian kings and Polish princes, and who entered into marriages with European dynasties. Yaroslav Osmomysl of Galicia, for example, was married to the daughter of the Hungarian king. His retinue included not only Slavic warriors, but also Hungarians, Poles, and even Germans. Such mixing could not but be reflected in the genetic makeup of the population. And what was happening in the daily lives of ordinary people? A peasant in a Viatich village might never travel beyond the neighboring churchyard in his entire life. But even in his lineage, blood other than Slavic might flow. His great-grandmother could have been from the Maria tribe, his great-grandfather from the Baltic Goland tribe. This genetic diversity was reflected in everything, in language, in customs, in beliefs. Christianity, which came to Rus' in the 10th century, was superimposed on a powerful layer of pagan traditions. But these traditions were different among different tribes. Among the Krivichi, Perun, the god of thunder and war, was especially revered. Among the Viatici, the main deity was Veles, the patron of cattle and wealth. For the Polans, the cult of Dazbog, the sun god, played an important role. And when these tribes adopted Christianity, their ancient gods did not disappear without a trace. They transformed into Christian saints, retaining many of their functions. Saint Elijah replaced Perun, Saint Blaise replaced Veles, and the Archangel Michael took on the functions of Dazbog. But in the popular memory, the connection with ancient roots was not broken. And this memory was also part of the genetic heritage, not biological, of course, but cultural. The artisans of that time were also a heterogeneous group. In Kiev, not only Slavic masters worked, but also Greek jewelers, Armenian traders, Jewish money changers, and Bulgar leather workers. Each brought their own secrets of craftsmanship, their own technologies, their own artistic traditions. Kievan goldsmiths learned the delicate art of enamel from the Byzantines and adopted the technique of granulation, decoration with tiny gold beads, from the steppe peoples. And the local traditions of Slavic casting and forging created completely new, unique forms. The weaponsmiths of that time also worked in an international style. A Russian sword could be forged in the Frankish style from Damascus steel, the hilt decorated with Scandinavian runes, and the scabbard with Byzantine enamel. Such a weapon was not just a tool of war, but a work of art, reflecting the complex cultural mosaic of the era. The women of ancient Rus were also very different. Princesses married foreign princes, bringing their customs, their attire, and their craftswomen with them. A Byzantine princess who became the wife of a Russian prince could change the fashion of an entire principality. And what about ordinary women? They didn't just stay at home either. Merchants' wives traveled with their husbands to distant lands, and craftswomen moved from city to city following work. Marriages were made not only within a tribe or principality, but also between different ethnic groups. The role of the church in these processes was particularly interesting. Orthodox monasteries became centers not only of spiritual, but also of cultural life. People from different lands and different tribes flocked there. A monk could be a Slav, a Greek, or a Bulgarian. In the monastery scriptoriums, books were copied in different languages, and works were created that reflected a synthesis of various cultural traditions. The Kiev-Pechersk monastery, for example, had already become a true international center in the 11th century. Not only Russian monks labored there, but also Greeks, South Slavs, and even people from Western Europe. Each brought something of their own, creating a unique fusion of Orthodox spirituality. The chronicles of those times also reflect this diversity. The primary chronicle tells not only about the Slavs, but also about the many other peoples who lived alongside them. The chronicler does not divide them into us and them. For him, they are all part of a single world where every nation has its place and its destiny. And what was daily life like in the cities of that time? Kiev in the 12th century had up to 50,000 inhabitants, a huge city for its time. People in all sorts of different clothes walked its streets, spoke different languages, and professed different faiths, although Orthodoxy was, of course, the main religion. The trading rows were striking in their variety of goods. Here one could buy silk from Byzantium, furs from Novgorod, silver jewelry from Bulgar, weapons from Western Europe, and spices from distant India. And all this was sold by people of the most varied nationalities, each with their own ways of trading, their own customs, their own understanding of honesty and profit. The artisan quarters were also international. A pottery quarter could be next to a blacksmith quarter, and in both, masters of different origins worked. The secrets of the craft were passed down not only from father to son, but also between representatives of different peoples, creating new techniques and styles. Even the language of that time was much more varied than we are used to thinking. The old Russian language had already absorbed many loanwords from Greek, from Turkic languages, from Scandinavian dialects. The words knyaz, prince, boyarin, boyar, and vityaz, knight, came from different sources but became an organic part of Russian speech. In different lands, people spoke with different accents and used different dialect words. A Novgorodian and a Kievan could understand each other, but you could immediately hear where each was from. And the differences between the North and the South were even greater. Family traditions also reflected this diversity. In princely families, children were often raised in different traditions, paternal and maternal. A Slavic prince married to a Polovtsian princess gave his children a dual upbringing. They learned both Slavic literacy and steppe customs, spoke several languages, and felt at home in different cultures. Military affairs were also international. Russian retinues included not only Slavic warriors, but also Varangians, steppe peoples, and Finno-Ugrians. Each group brought its own combat traditions, its own weapons, its own tactics. A Russian prince could fight with heavy cavalry in the European style, light cavalry in the steppe style, or infantry formations in the Slavic tradition. depending on the situation. And what were the religious beliefs of the common people? Officially, Russes had been Christian for more than 2 centuries, but among the common folk, Christianity was surprisingly intertwined with ancient beliefs. Moreover, this happened differently among different tribes. Among the northern Slavs, water cults associated with the abundance of rivers and lakes were strong. Holy springs, the veneration of rusalkas and water spirits, and special rituals for the Epiphany, all of this reflected the ancient beliefs of the Finno-Ugric tribes mixed with Slavic traditions. In the south, solar cults associated with steppe culture were stronger. Summer solstice festivals, special veneration of light and fire, and complex calendar rituals. Here one could feel the influence of both Slavic and Iranian traditions that came from the steppe through the Scythians and Sarmatians. The mythology of that time was also richer and more diverse than modern mythology. Each tribe remembered its own heroes, its own bogatirs, its own legends. And when these tribes united under the rule of the Kievan princes, their mythologies also began to intertwine, creating a common Russian epic. Ilya Muromets, for example, was originally a hero of Vyatich Bylinas, but he gradually became an all-Russian bogatyr, the defender of the entire Russian land. And alongside him stood heroes of other tribes, Dobrynya from the Novgorod lands, Alyosha Popovich from the Rostov region. Female characters in folklore also reflected ethnic diversity. Vasilisa the Wise could be a Slavic princess, a steppe sorceress, or a Finno-Ugric shaman. The main thing was that she was wise, beautiful, and helped the hero in difficult times. The economic life of pre-Mongol Rus was also built on ethnic diversity. Different peoples engaged in different trades. The Slavs were primarily farmers, but they also mastered river trade excellently. The Finno-Ugrians were famous as hunters and fishermen and knew the secrets of forest crafts. The steppe peoples were unsurpassed cattle and horse breeders. The exchange between these economic systems created a complex but effective economic system. A Slavic merchant could trade grain for furs with a Finno-Ugric hunter and then sell those furs in Byzantium for silk and gold. A steppe horse breeder supplied war horses for the princely retinues, receiving iron weapons and jewelry in return. Even the calendar systems were different among different peoples. The Slavs counted years from the creation of the world, the Byzantines from the birth of Christ, and the steppe peoples by 12-year cycles. And all of this somehow coexisted, creating a complex but functioning system of timekeeping. Holidays also reflected cultural diversity. Alongside Christian holidays, pagan rituals were celebrated, and each tribe had its own. Maslenitsa among the Vyatichi was not celebrated in the same way as among the Novgorodians. Ivan Kupala Day among the Polans was different from the same holiday among the Krivichi. But the most surprising thing is how all this diversity coexisted within a single civilization. People of different tribes, different cultures, and different beliefs felt they were part of a common world. They were united not only by the rule of the Kievan princes, but also by a common understanding of what the Russian land was. This understanding was not imposed from above. It grew from below, from daily contacts, from living together, from mixed marriages, from common interests. 12th century Russes was not a nation-state in the modern sense, but a civilizational project where every nation had its place and its role. The Great Migration, who came from the east, imagine a winter day in the year 1237. Somewhere on the border of the Eurasian Principality stands a small outpost. The Druzhiniks are warming themselves by a fire. Their horses snort in the frost, steam rising from their mouths. An ordinary winter day, one of many. But this day will be the last peaceful day in the history of Russes for many centuries to come. because there, beyond the horizon, a force is already moving that will change everything. Not just an army, an entire world in motion, a world that Russes had not yet known, but which it would soon know all too well. So who were they, these mysterious conquerors from the East? For a long time, we imagined them quite primitively, savage nomads on small horses, living by plunder and robbery. But modern science has revealed a completely different picture to us. What moved on Russes in the winter of 1237 was not just an army, but an entire civilization on the march. To begin with, the very word Mongols, as applied to the conquerors of Rus, is quite conditional. Yes, the impetus for this great movement was given by Temujin, whom we know as Genghis Khan. Yes, it was the Mongol tribes that became the core of the new empire. But by the time Genghis Khan's grandson Batu led his Tumans to the west, the army of conquerors was no longer ethnically Mongol. Imagine a snowball rolling down a mountain. At first it's small, consisting only of the snow that was packed at the top. But the further it rolls, the bigger it gets, picking up new layers. So it was with the Mongol Empire, starting with small tribes somewhere in the upper reaches of the Onon River, it rolled across all of Asia, absorbing dozens of peoples into itself. By 1237, within what we call the Mongol army, there were relatively few actual Mongols. They formed the command structure, the elite units, the nobility. But the main mass of warriors was represented by completely different peoples. The majority were Kipchaks, the very same Polovtsians with whom the Russian princes had been fighting, making peace, and intermarrying for more than a century. The irony of history, the main enemies of Russes became the descendants of its old acquaintances. The Kipchak tribes, conquered by the Mongols under Genghis Khan, formed the basis of the Mongol cavalry. They knew the steppe roads perfectly, knew where to find water and fodder for the horses, and knew the strengths and weaknesses of Russian military tactics. Alongside the Kipchaks marched the Naimans, a people who had once competed with the Mongols for dominance in the steppe. The Naimans were a fairly developed people. Many of them professed Nestorian Christianity and had a writing system based on the Sogdian alphabet. Within the Mongol army, they often served as administrators, scribes, and diplomats. The Merkits, Karakitans, Kangli, and Tatars, the latter, by the way, were so numerous that their name eventually became the common name for all the peoples of the Golden Horde. Each tribe brought something of its own: combat traditions, craft skills, knowledge of the terrain. But that's not all. As the army moved west, it was replenished with local peoples. From Central Asia, the Khwarezmians joined them, descendants of the ancient Sogdians and Bactrians, heirs to the great cities of the Silk Road. They brought with them a high urban culture, knowledge of trade, crafts, and science. From the Caucasus, the Alans joined the army, descendants of the Sarmatians, a people with rich martial traditions. The Alans were excellent heavy-armed horsemen. Their armored cavalry could fight on equal terms with European knights. Many Alans were Christians, which would later play an important role in their relations with the Russian population. Circassians, Lezgins, even Georgians and Armenians, all were, to one degree or another, drawn into this great movement. Some voluntarily, in hopes of plunder and glory, others by force, but all became part of the power that was advancing on Rus. Now imagine how diverse this army was. Mongol Noyans in silk robes and armor made of leather plates, Kipchak Khans in high felt hats and gold necklaces, Khwarezmian engineers with their siege machines and knowledge of Chinese technologies, Alan knights in chainmail and helmets similar to European ones, Naiman Nestorians with crosses on their chests. Many languages were spoken in this army, Mongol was the language of command, Turkic dialects were the language of communication between different tribes, and Persian was the language of diplomacy and administration. Chinese was known by engineers and artillerymen, and Arabic by Muslim jurists and doctors. There were also many religions. The Mongols, for the most part, professed Tengrism, faith in the eternal blue sky. But among them were also Buddhists, Nestorians, and even shamans of the old school. Muslims made up a significant portion of the Central Asian contingents. Christians of various denominations, Nestorians, Armenian monophysites, Orthodox Alans, were also widely represented. This religious diversity had important consequences. From the very beginning, the Mongol Khans pursued a policy of religious tolerance. They did not impose their faith on the conquered peoples. Moreover, they often patronized local religions, seeing them as an instrument of governance. But let's return to the army itself. How was it organized? The Mongols created perhaps the most perfect military machine of their time. Their decimal system, tens, hundreds, thousands, tumens, allowed them to manage huge masses of troops. Moreover, warriors of different tribes were mixed in each unit, which prevented separatism and promoted mutual learning. A Kipchak horseman could teach a Mongol the subtleties of archery on the move. An Alan armored warrior could show how to effectively attack an infantry formation. A Khwarezmian could explain the principles of a trebuchet or catapult. A Chinese master could share the secrets of making gunpowder and fire arrows. And what were these people like in character, in mentality? For a long time, they were depicted only as cruel barbarians. But this is a very one-sided view. Yes, the Mongol wars were distinguished by particular ruthlessness. But in peacetime, the Mongols and their allies showed completely different qualities. They were surprisingly open to foreign cultures. The Mongol nobility easily adopted the customs of the conquered peoples, dressed in their clothes, studied their languages, and married their women. This openness was not a weakness, but a strength. It allowed them to create complex multinational state structures. They were pragmatic and rational. If a local tradition or technology proved useful, they would borrow it without hesitation. Chinese siege engines, Persian methods of administration, Arab mathematical knowledge, everything was put to use. They possessed an amazing ability to adapt. Steppe people by origin, they quickly mastered the art of besieging cities. Traditional nomads, they created an effective administrative system for governing settled peoples. Pagans and shamans, they treated a wide variety of religions with equal respect. And one more important quality, they knew how to value talent. In the Mongol army, one could make a career regardless of origin. A skilled commander, a good administrator, a talented artisan could rise very high, even if born in a conquered tribe. Jebe, one of Genghis Khan's best commanders, started as a simple warrior of a hostile tribe. Yelu Chukai, the great Khan's chief advisor on Chinese affairs, was a descendant of the emperors of the defeated Liao dynasty. Mahmud Yalavach, who governed Central Asia, came from a family of Khwarezmian merchants. Such a meritocracy was a revolution for its time. In Europe and Rus, nobility was determined by birth. In China, by a complex system of examinations and traditions. The Mongols, however, promoted people solely for their abilities and personal qualities. But what did these people look like physically? Modern anthropology allows us to picture this quite accurately. The Mongols themselves were typical Central Asians of medium height, stocky build, with characteristic Mongoloid facial features. Wide cheekbones, narrow eyes with an epicanthic fold, dark hair, and swarthy skin. The Kipchaks looked different. They were classic Caucasoids of the steppe type, tall, slender, often fair-haired and blue-eyed. It's no wonder Russian chronicles called them Polovtsians, from the word polovi, meaning straw-colored. The Naimans and Merkits were intermediate, the result of centuries of mixing between Mongoloid and Caucasoid populations of the steppe. They could have narrow eyes and fair hair, be tall, and have wide cheekbones, a wide variety of combinations. The peoples of Central Asia, Khwarezmians, Sogdians, represented the classic Iranian anthropological type: tall, slender, with regular facial features, dark eyes, and hair. Many of them could easily pass for Southern Europeans. The Alans were typical Caucasoids of the Caucasian type: tall, broad-shouldered, with sharply defined facial features. Among them were both blondes and brunettes, but light brown hair with gray or brown eyes predominated. This entire diverse mass of people moved west, guided by common goals, but retaining their own characteristics. Each tribe, each nation, carried within it not only martial qualities, but also a cultural baggage that was bound to influence the conquered lands. The Mongols brought with them their system of law, the Yasa of Genghis Khan, their military organization, their ideas about power and the state. The Kipchaks brought rich steppe traditions, epic tales, a special culture of horse breeding. The Khwarezmians brought commercial experience, knowledge of crafts, and connections with distant lands. But most importantly, they all brought their genes, the very genes that mixed with the Russian ones and created a new anthropological appearance for the Eastern Slavs. Mongoloid genes from the Mongols themselves, Caucasoid steppe genes from the Kipchaks, Caucasian genes from the Alans, and Near Eastern genes from the Khwarezmians. This genetic material did not just add to the existing Russian gene pool, it interacted with it, creating new combinations, new types. In one family, children with completely different appearances could be born, one looking like the Slavic father, another like the stepmother, a third like the Caucasian grandmother. And what were the family traditions of the conquerors? Mongol society was patriarchal, but women enjoyed considerable rights. Mongol wives could manage the household, trade, and even command troops in their husband's absence. This was a sharp contrast to the Russian traditions of the time, where women were more dependent on men. Polygamy was the norm for the Mongol nobility. The great Khan could have hundreds of wives and concubines from different tribes and peoples. This was not only a personal whim, but also a political tool. Each marriage sealed an alliance with a new tribe or dynasty. Children from different wives had equal inheritance rights, which often led to internal strife. But at the same time, it ensured the genetic diversity of the ruling elite, preventing its degeneration. The religious tolerance of the Mongols also had genetic consequences. When a Mongol Khan married a Christian woman, their children could be raised in both traditions. When a Muslim merchant from the Mongol army married a Russian boyar's daughter, their offspring carried the genes of 3 different populations. This mixing occurred at all levels of society. A Mongol temnik could take a Russian princess as his wife, and a common Kipchak warrior could marry the daughter of a Russian artisan. In the first case, the children received high social status and political influence. In the second, they simply dissolved into the local population, passing on their genes. The linguistic situation in the conqueror's army was also complex. Only the elite knew the Mongolian language. Most warriors communicated in various Turkic dialects, which gradually mixed into a kind of common steppe koine, a common language. This language later became the basis for the language of the Golden Horde, absorbing elements of Mongolian, Kipchak, Oghuz, Karluk, and other dialects. Cultural traditions also mixed and mutually enriched each other. Mongol heroic songs combined with Kipchak epic tales, Khwarezmian scientific knowledge intertwined with Chinese natural philosophy, Alan military customs supplemented Mongol tactics. And what was daily life like in this moving army? Imagine a huge nomadic city stretching for tens of kilometers. In front, light reconnaissance cavalry looking for enemies and plunder. Behind them, the main combat units, ready for battle at any moment. Further back, the baggage train with families, herds, and artisans. In this baggage train lived not only the warriors, but also their wives, children, and the elderly. Mongol women managed the covered wagons, milked the mares, and prepared kumis. Kipchak girls herded sheep and goats. Khwarezmian masters repaired weapons, made arrows, and mended saddles right on the march. Children grew up in this nomadic school, mastering all the necessary skills from an early age. Boys learned to shoot a bow, ride a horse, and understand military tactics. Girls learned to manage the household, weave, cook, and treat wounds. But most importantly, they grew accustomed to a multinational environment from childhood. A Mongol boy played with a Kipchak peer, learned Turkic words, and adopted step games. A Kipchak girl befriended a Khwarezmian girl of the same age, learned the skills of urban crafts, and became acquainted with Muslim customs. This environment shaped a special type of person, cosmopolitan, open to cultural contact, and easily adaptable to new conditions. It was precisely these kinds of people who came to Russes in the year 1237. They brought with them not only swords and arrows, but also new ideas, new technologies, and new perceptions of the world. And when this force collided with Russian civilization, it was not just a conquest, but a great mixing, the results of which we can still observe today. Mechanisms of mixing, marital unions and assimilation. Imagine the spring of the year 1241. Several years have passed since the great devastation, cities are beginning to recover, and life is slowly returning to normal. And in one of these cities, let's say Eurasian, a wedding is taking place. An ordinary wedding, it would seem, except that the groom is a Tatar Murza and the bride is the daughter of a Russian boyar. An Orthodox priest marries them, but at the celebration, both Russian songs and steppe melodies are heard. The guests eat both honey with kolaches and mare's milk with lamb. They speak a mixture of Russian and Turkic languages. And no one is surprised by this. Such marriages are becoming commonplace. This is the story of our great mixing, a story of how two worlds, the Russian and the steppe, intertwined into one, creating something completely new. It was not a conquest in its purest form, not assimilation, not genocide. It was integration, complex, painful, but ultimately surprisingly fruitful. Let's start from the very top, with princely marriages. Here, politics and genetics were intertwined in the closest possible way. The Russian princes quickly realized that to survive in the New World, they needed not only to fight, but also to be friends. And the best way to confirm friendship is to become related by marriage. Alexander Nevsky, that symbol of Russian resistance to the invaders, was actually one of the first to seek rapprochement with the Horde. He not only traveled to pay homage to Batu, but also became a sworn brother to his son Sartak. And in those days, sworn brotherhood was often sealed by the marriage of their children. Alexander Nevsky's son, Daniil of Moscow, married the daughter of a Horde Temnik. Their children were already half Russian, half Tatar, and no one saw anything shameful in this. On the contrary, they were proud of their dual heritage. Dmitry Donskoy, the hero of the Battle of Kulikovo, also had Tatar roots on his mother's side, and his opponent, Mamai, was married to the daughter of the Byzantine emperor. You see how complicatedly everything was intertwined? Russian princes married Tatar khans, who in turn married Byzantine emperors, and as a result, an incredibly intricate but strong network of kinship ties was created. These marriages had not only political but also cultural significance. A Tatar princess, by marrying a Russian prince, brought with her a retinue, artisans, and traditions. Her children were raised in two cultures, spoke two languages, and professed, formally or informally, two religions. Imagine such a princely family. The father is a Russian prince, speaks Russian, prays in an Orthodox church, and wears Slavic clothing. The mother is a Tatar princess, speaks a Turkic language, preserves steppe customs, and may secretly adhere to Islam or Tengrism. And the children? They absorb both. The son of such a family could pray in an Orthodox church in the morning and listen to steppe tales from his Tatar grandmother in the evening. He knew both the bylinas about Russian bogatirs and the legends of Mongol batirs. He spoke two languages and understood the subtleties of two cultures. And the daughter? She could marry either a Russian boyar or a Tatar Mirza, and in either case she would feel at home. Such women became living bridges between cultures, passing traditions from generation to generation. But princely marriages are only the tip of the iceberg. Much more important was the mixing at the level of the common people. And here, the mechanisms were completely different. After the conquest, many Tatar warriors remained in Russes. Some received lands as a reward for service, some simply settled in places they liked, and some married Russian women and no longer wanted to return to the steppe. There were many such people, several tens of thousands, perhaps even more. Imagine such a warrior. His name, let's say, is Mamai, a common Turkic name. He participated in Batu's campaign and received several villages somewhere near Ryazan as a reward. He built himself an estate and started a farm. And then he married the daughter of a local boyar, or just a peasant woman, if he himself was not very noble. Their children turned out to be amazing. In appearance they might resemble their father, dark-skinned, with narrow eyes and high cheekbones. Or they could take after their mother, fair-skinned, blue-eyed, with soft features. But their character was a mix. From their father they inherited the freedom of the steppe, the ability to ride a horse, a disdain for danger, and a tendency toward a nomadic life. From their mother they inherited Russian thoroughness, a love for the land, the Orthodox faith, and Slavic traditions. Such children often became excellent warriors. They combined Turkic agility with Russian steadfastness, steppe cunning with Slavic directness. Many of them later served the Moscow princes and became the founders of famous boyar families. The Godunovs, for example, descended from the Tatar Murza Chet, who converted to Orthodoxy and received lands from the Moscow prince. The Yusupovs traced their lineage to Khan Yusuf. The Apraxins from the Horde prince Solokmir, who was baptized as Prokopi. But that's not all. There were also reverse cases, when Russians found themselves in a Tatar environment and were assimilated there. Prisoners of war, refugees, voluntary migrants, all of them gradually dissolved into the steppe population but retained something of their Slavic roots. A Russian artisan, taken captive to the Horde, could marry a Tatar woman there, convert to Islam, and become part of Horde society. But his children and grandchildren would still carry Russian genes and Russian cultural traits. After several generations, they might even forget their Slavic origins, but the genetic trace would remain. Trade also contributed to the mixing. Russian merchants constantly traveled to the Horde and Tatar merchants to Rus. Many of them lived far from home for long periods, started local families, and had children. These children acquired a dual identity, both Russian and Tatar. Imagine such a two-souled merchant. In Moscow, he has a Russian wife and children. In Sarai, a Tatar family. He speaks both languages fluently, knows both cultures, and feels equally comfortable in an Orthodox church and a Muslim mosque. His children from his Russian wife consider themselves Russian, but know the Tatar language, understand steppe customs, and have connections in the horde. The children from his Tatar wife, on the other hand, are Tatars, but with Russian roots, Russian connections, and an understanding of Slavic culture. Over time, these trading dynasties created a special layer of Russo-Tatar merchants. They were intermediaries not only in trade, but also in cultural exchange. Through them, Russian culture penetrated the horde, and Tatar culture penetrated Rus. Artisans also actively mixed. After the devastation of the cities, they needed to be rebuilt, and there was a shortage of craftsmen. The Tatar Khans specifically relocated artisans from different countries, creating multinational production centers. In the rebuilt Ryazan, a Russian blacksmith, a Tatar weaponsmith, a Khwarezmian jeweler, and an Armenian merchant could work side by side. They not only exchanged professional secrets, but also created mixed families. The daughter of a Russian blacksmith could marry a Tatar weaponsmith. Their son would become a master who combined Russian metallurgical traditions with Eastern hardening techniques. And their daughter would marry an Armenian merchant, and so on. This mixing created amazing cultural hybrids. Russian masters adopted Eastern ornaments, while Tatar masters adopted Slavic forms. New styles appeared in architecture, decorative arts, and weaponry. And what role did women play in these processes? An enormous one. In medieval society, women were the main keepers of cultural traditions. They passed on language, customs, and beliefs to their children. A Russian woman who married a Tatar Mirza might formally adopt his faith, but at home, in the family circle, she would continue to speak Russian with her children, tell Russian fairy tales, and sing Russian songs. And conversely, a Tatar woman in a Russian family would preserve steppe traditions and pass them on to her children. Children in such families grew up bilingual and bicultural. They knew both Russian Bylinas and Tatar Dastans equally well. They understood both Slavic soulfulness and steppe pride. They could be both Orthodox Christians and followers of Tengri simultaneously. The religious aspect of the mixing is also very interesting. Formally, Russes remained Orthodox, and the horde gradually became Islamized. But in practice, the boundaries were much more blurred. Many Tatars who settled in Russes converted to Orthodoxy, but they adopted it in their own way, retaining elements of their traditional beliefs. In their understanding, Christ could be combined with Tengri, the Mother of God with Umay-Ene, and Orthodox saints with ancestral spirits. Russians who found themselves in a Tatar environment sometimes converted to Islam. But their Islam was also special, with a mixture of Christian ideas, Slavic customs, and pagan remnants. And there were also families where no particular distinction was made between religions at all. A Tatar father could pray to Allah, a Russian mother to Christ, and the children to both, seeing no contradiction in this. Such religious syncretism was quite common, especially in the border regions. Linguistic mixing occurred even faster than religious mixing. In mixed families, children heard two languages from childhood. Russian words were interspersed with Turkic ones, creating a special family jargon. Gradually, this jargon spread beyond families and became the language of communication for entire regions. In the southern principalities, where the Tatar population was particularly large, a special Russo-Turkic coin, a common language, was formed. This language left a deep mark on the Russian language. Thousands of words that we today consider to be originally Russian actually came from Turkic languages during the Horde era. Dengi, money; kazna, treasury; tovar, goods; bazar, bazaar; sunduk, chest; kaftan, bashmak, shoe. All these are traces of that great linguistic mixing. And what happened to the children of mixed marriages? Their fate varied, depending on the specific circumstances. If the father was a noble Tatar and the mother was a Russian boyar's daughter, the children usually received a high status in the horde hierarchy. They could become Mirzas, Temniks, even Khans, but they also maintained ties with their Russian relatives and understood Slavic culture. If it was the other way around, the father a Russian prince, the mother a Tatar princess, the children were most often considered Russian, but with Tatar roots. They could inherit princely thrones, but also had influence in the horde. At the level of the common people, everything was simpler. Children from mixed marriages usually adopted the culture and religion of the parent who was more influential in that particular area. In Russian regions, they became Russian. In Tatar regions, they became Tatars. But many retained a dual identity. They formally considered themselves Russian, but knew the Tatar language, remembered their steppe relatives, and observed some Turkic customs. Or, conversely, they were Tatars, but with Russian roots. Such a dual identity was not considered something strange or reprehensible. On the contrary, people were proud of their mixed heritage, seeing it as an advantage. After all, they could serve as intermediaries between cultures, understood both sides, and had connections both here and there. The mixed military dynasties were particularly interesting. The descendants of Tatar warriors who settled in Rusas often became professional soldiers in Russian service. They combined steppe mobility with Russian steadfastness, Turkic cunning with Slavic directness. Such warriors were very valuable. They knew Tatar tactics from the inside, could predict the enemy's actions, and spoke the enemy's language. At the same time, they were loyal to the Russian princes and defended the Russian land as their own. Many of them became the founders of famous service families. Their descendants served the Grand Princes of Moscow and later the Russian Tsars. Some rose to the rank of boyar, received high titles, and became part of the Russian aristocracy. And what happened to the women in these processes of mixing? Their role was enormous, though not always visible. A Tatar woman who married a Russian man became a conduit of steppe culture into the Russian environment. She taught her children the Turkic language, told steppe fairy tales, cooked Tatar dishes, and observed Eastern customs. A Russian woman in a Tatar family, on the contrary, preserved and passed on Slavic traditions. Her children might look Tatar on the outside, but carried a Russian soul within. Such women often became cultural intermediaries, helping their husbands understand a foreign culture and establish relations with people of other ethnicities. Through them, not only genetic, but also cultural exchange took place. Children from mixed marriages often found themselves in a difficult position. On the one hand, they had access to two cultures, which gave them certain advantages. On the other hand, they constantly had to choose who to consider themselves, which tradition to follow. Many resolved this dilemma pragmatically. They were Russians among Russians and Tatars among Tatars. This required a certain flexibility, an ability to adapt, but it also opened up wide opportunities. Such people often became diplomats, interpreters, and traders, professions where knowledge of different cultures was particularly valuable. They could negotiate with horde ambassadors, trade with Eastern merchants, and serve at the courts of both Russian princes and Tatar Khans. Gradually, over several generations, this mixing became so common that it ceased to be surprising. In the 15th century, many noble families had a mixed Russo-Tatar origin. This was not hidden, but, on the contrary, emphasized in genealogies as a sign of the family's antiquity and nobility. Thus, a new type of Russian person was formed, more open to the world, more flexible, more capable of cultural contact. This type was very different from the pre-Mongol Rus's inhabitant, but it was he who became the basis for the future Russian Empire with its multinational and multi-confessional character. Regional peculiarities from Novgorod to Ryazan. Let's mentally take a journey through 14th century Rus. Imagine that we are merchants carrying goods from one principality to another, and in each new place we see amazing things. How differently the Mongol invasion affected different lands, how unevenly the great mixing of peoples occurred. Let's begin our journey in the north, in the Lord Novgorod the Great. Here, on the banks of the Volkhov River, time seems to have stood still. The Veche bell still summons the citizens to the square, merchant ships still ply the northern rivers, and artisans still work in their workshops. The Mongol invasion only touched Novgorod lightly. The city was not taken by storm, did not suffer devastation, and did not experience mass migrations of steppe peoples. Prince Alexander managed to negotiate peacefully with the Horde, and Novgorod paid tribute without losing its freedoms. Therefore, genetic mixing here was minimal. Yes, a few Tatar families appeared, merchants, diplomats, defectors. Yes, some Novgorodian merchants married Tatar women on their trading journeys. But these were isolated cases that did not change the overall picture. If we look at a Novgorodian of that time, he would differ little from his pre-Mongol great-grandfather. The same fair northern type, the same blue or gray eyes, the same light brown hair, perhaps a slightly taller stature, the result of good nutrition in a wealthy trading city. But no Eastern features, no traces of steppe mixing. However, the changes in language were more noticeable. Novgorodian merchants traded with the Horde, knew Turkic languages, and brought back Eastern goods with their names. Words like dengi, money, kazna, treasury, and tovar, goods, entered the Novgorodian speech at that time. But these were superficial borrowings that did not affect the foundations of the language. The culture also changed little. The Novgorodians remained just as independent, enterprising, and freedom-loving. Their Vesh traditions, their trading spirit, their special northern character, all this was preserved almost unchanged. Now let's move south to Moscow. Here the picture is completely different. Moscow of that time is no longer a purely Slavic city. It is a multinational center where Tatars live alongside Russians, where Orthodox churches stand next to Muslim mosques, and where speech in a dozen languages can be heard on the streets. From the very beginning, the Moscow princes chose a strategy of active cooperation with the Horde. Ivan Kalita, Simeon the Proud, Ivan the Red, all of them not only traveled to the Horde for yarliks, but also invited Tatar nobility to serve them, gave them lands, and intermarried with them. In Moscow, many Tatar service families were formed. The Glinskys, Ismailovs, Mansurovs, Tenishevs, their ancestors came from the Horde and settled in the Moscow lands. But they did not remain a foreign element. They integrated into local society and became part of the Moscow elite. These people converted to Orthodoxy but retained many steppe traditions. They spoke Russian but also knew Turkic languages. They served the Moscow princes but maintained ties with the Horde. And their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren carried a mixture of two cultures within them. Look at a Moscow boyar of the 15th century. In appearance, he may be quite European, fair hair, regular features, tall stature. But look closer, and you will see a slight slant to the eyes, characteristic cheekbones, a swarthy complexion. And in his movements, in his posture, there is something of the steppe, a familiarity with horses and weapons. There were far more Turkic words in the Moscow dialect than in the Novgorodian one. Loshad, horse, sobaka, dog, sarai, shed, ambar, barn, kaftan, bashmak, shoe. All these came into the Russian language precisely through Moscow, through constant contact with the Horde. And how different the family traditions were. In a Moscow boyar family, both Russian and Tatar customs could be observed. Children learned both Church Slavonic literacy and Arabic script. They knew both Orthodox prayers and steppe incantations. Now let's travel even further south to the Ryazan lands. Here the Mongol influence was most pronounced. Ryazan was one of the first cities to fall to Batu's attacks. The local nobility was partially exterminated, partially taken captive, and new masters came to the depopulated lands, Tatar Murzas and Baskaks. Entire districts of the Ryazan region were settled by steppe peoples. They brought their families, livestock, and traditions with them. They mixed with the local population, but retained many features of nomadic life. As a result, a special sub-ethnic group was formed, the Ryazan Tatars, or Meshchera. These people were no longer pure nomads, but not yet fully settled farmers. They engaged in cattle breeding, agriculture, and crafts. They spoke a mixture of Russian and Turkic languages. They professed orthodoxy, but with a mixture of Muslim and Tengrian beliefs. In appearance, the Ryazan peasants of that time were noticeably different from the Novgorodians. Darker-skinned with characteristic steppe features, they bore clear traces of Mongoloid mixing, but at the same time they remained Orthodox, spoke Russian, and considered themselves Russian people. There were especially many Turkisms in the Ryazan dialects. The names of animals, plants, household items, and farming methods all bore traces of steppe influence. To this day, in Ryazan villages, one can hear words that have long been forgotten in other places. And what was happening in the Volga region? Here, an even more complex picture was emerging. Nizhny Novgorod, Kazan, the Bulgar cities, all became centers of active cultural mixing. Russians, Tatars, Mordvins, Chuvash, Mari, all these peoples lived side by side, traded, intermarried, and exchanged traditions. In Nizhny Novgorod, a special merchant environment was formed where national differences were almost erased. A Russian merchant could have a Tatar name, and a Tatar merchant could be baptized into Orthodoxy. Their children grew up in a multilingual environment, absorbing the traditions of all the peoples of the Volga region. The Bulgar cities, which became part of the Golden Horde, also changed. Russian settlers, steppe nomads, and Central Asian merchants were added to the traditional Bulgar population. A new type of urban culture was emerging, Muslim by religion, but multinational in composition. In Kazan, which became one of the centers of the Horde, the Russian influence was very noticeable. Many Kazan Tatars had Russian roots, knew the Russian language, and maintained ties with the Russian principalities, and Russian merchants and artisans made up a significant part of the urban population. In the west, in the Galician-Volhynian Principality, the situation was unique. These lands were on the border of the Orthodox and Catholic worlds and were influenced by the Horde, Poland, and Hungary. The Mongol impact here was weaker, but Western influences were stronger. The Galician and Volhynian princes actively intermarried with European dynasties. Daniel of Galicia was married to the daughter of the Hungarian king and received a royal crown from the Pope. His descendants maintained close ties with Poland, Hungary, and Lithuania. As a result, the population of the Western principalities retained more pre-Mongol features but acquired some Western European characteristics. Here, one could find the influence of Catholic culture, Latin education, and chivalric traditions. And what was happening in the northeastern lands, in Vladimir, Suzdal, Rostov? These ancient centers of Ruses suffered a heavy blow during the invasion, but managed to recover. The Mongol influence here was moderate, more than in Novgorod, but less than in Ryazan. The princes of Vladimir and Suzdal pursued a cautious policy. They regularly paid tribute and traveled to the Horde, but tried to preserve local traditions. There were few Tatar settlers and few mixed marriages. As a result, a special Vladimir Suzdal type was formed, conservative, cautious, and prone to compromise. These people knew how to get along with the horde, but at the same time preserved their Russian identity. It was they who later became the basis of the Moscow boyars. The Tver lands were the opposite of Moscow. The Tver princes more often conflicted with the horde and were less willing to compromise. As a result, there was less Tatar influence here, but more pre-Mongol traditions were preserved. The people of Tver were famous for their independence, pride, and unwillingness to submit. These qualities helped them to compete with Moscow for a long time, but in the end, they were the cause of their defeat. Moscow's flexibility defeated Tver's straightforwardness. In the southern lands, in the Kiev, Pereyaslav, and Chernigov principalities, the Mongol invasion left particularly deep traces. These territories were the most severely devastated, many cities were deserted, and the population partially moved north or west. New inhabitants came to the empty lands, steppe peoples, settlers from the horde, refugees from various countries. A new ethnic composition was formed, noticeably different from the pre-Mongol one. Here, the Mongoloid admixture was particularly noticeable. Kiev, once the mother of Russian cities, became a small provincial center. Its population was mixed: Russians, Tatars, Armenians, Jews, Polovtsians. The old boyar families disappeared, and their place was taken by new people of various origins. And what was happening in the countryside? Here the picture was even more varied. In the northern regions, the villages changed little. The same izbas, the same fields, the same peasant families, except that the taxes became heavier and horde tribute collectors appeared. In the southern and eastern regions, the changes were drastic. Tatar auls appeared next to Russian villages. Peasants learned new farming techniques from each other, exchanged seeds and livestock breeds, and intermarried. Mixed settlements were formed where Russian and Tatar families lived side by side. Children played together, adults helped each other with work, and the elderly shared their experience and knowledge. National differences gradually faded away. The border regions were particularly interesting, between the forest and the steppe, between Christian and Muslim lands. Here, special sub-ethnic groups were formed, combining the features of different peoples. The Cossacks, for example, were initially just such a mixed community. Their ranks included Russian fugitives, Tatar outcasts, and representatives of other peoples. They were united not by nationality, but by a way of life, a free life in the steppe, service to various masters, and a living made by war and plunder. The Meshchera are another example of such mixing. They were Russified Finno-Ugrians with a large admixture of Tatar blood. They preserved some ancient traditions but already spoke Russian and were considered Russian. Gradually, by the end of the 15th century, regional differences began to smooth out. The Moscow princes were uniting the Russian lands, creating a unified state. And along with political unification came cultural convergence. But traces of regional peculiarities remained for a long time. The northerners remained more conservative, the southerners more open to eastern influences. The Novgorodians preserved their trading spirit, the Ryazanians their steppe freedom, the Vladimirtsev their cautious diplomacy. These differences were manifested in everything: in language dialects, in peculiarities of daily life, in people's character, and even in their appearance. An experienced person could tell at a glance where his interlocutor was from the north or the south, from a trading or an agricultural area, from a purely Russian or a mixed region. This diversity was the richness of Russian culture. Each region contributed something of its own to the common treasury. Northern Belinas were different from southern ones, Moscow chronicles from Novgorodian ones, Ryazan customs from Tver ones. And all these differences, all this diversity, was the result of the great mixing that began in the 13th century. The Mongol invasion did not just destroy the old Russes, it created a new one, more complex, richer, and more open to the world. In the next chapter, we will talk about how this mixing was reflected in the culture, how the language, art, and customs of the Russian people changed. But it is already clear. The regional peculiarities of this process determined many features of modern Russia, its internal diversity, its ability to unite a wide variety of traditions and peoples. Cultural revolution, language, customs, mentality. Imagine a typical day in a Russian home in the 15th century. The housewife gets up early, goes to milk the cow, but she no longer calls the cow by the old Slavic govyado, but by the Turkic sigir, although this word itself has long since become Russified and sounds like skotina. Her husband is getting ready for a journey, putting on a kaftan, a Persian word that came through Turkic languages. On his feet, he wears bashmaki, from the Turkic bashmak. He tucks a purse with money into his belt. Both words came from the Horde. The children are having breakfast, eating kalashes with honey. Kalash, from the Turkic kolash, meaning round bread. After breakfast, the older son goes to trade at the bazaar, another Turkism. The younger is sent to a neighbor for some tovari, another Eastern word that has become native. And no one notices that half the words they use in daily life came from the East. These words have become so organically integrated into Russian speech that they seem native. And yet, each of them is a witness to the great cultural revolution that took place in Rus' after the Mongol invasion. Language is the living memory of a people, and the Russian language of that era tells an amazing story of how two worlds, the Slavic and the steppe, slowly grew together, creating something completely new. Before the Mongol invasion, the old Russian language was a fairly closed system. Of course, there were loanwords even then, from Greek, from Old Church Slavonic, from Scandinavian languages. But these were drops in the ocean of Slavic speech. And then a real explosion occurred. In 2 or 3 centuries, the Russian language absorbed thousands of new words, new concepts, and even new ways of expressing thoughts. Let's start with the most important, administrative vocabulary. The entire system of governance created by the Mongols required new terms. Kazna, treasury, from the Turkic kazna. Dengi, money, from the Turkic tenge, a silver coin. Poshlina, duty, tax, from Arabic through Turkic languages. Tamozhnya, customs, from the Turkic tamga, a seal, a mark. Yamshchik, coachman, from the Mongolian yam, a postal station. Sarai, palace, shed, from Persian through Turkic languages. Kazakh, Cossack, a Turkic word meaning a free man, an adventurer. All these words not only enriched the Russian vocabulary, they changed the Russian people's ideas about power, governance, and the state. Military vocabulary was also almost completely renewed. Ataman, chieftain, from the Turkic ata, father and man, Esol, captain, a Turkic military rank. Sotnik, centurion, Uryadnik, officer, calques of Turkic military terms. Bulava, mace, a symbol of a commander's authority, from the Turkic bulat. Even words for weapons often had Eastern origins. Sablia, saber, from Hungarian, but which came from Turkic languages. Kinjal, dagger, from Arabic through Turkic languages. Kolchan, quiver, of Turkic origin. And the commercial vocabulary. Here, Eastern loanwords made up almost half the dictionary. Tovar, goods, from the Turkic tabar, cattle, property. Bazaar, a Persian word that came through Turkic languages. Lavka, shop, from the Arabic laha, a board, a counter. Arshin, a measure of length, from Arabic through Turkic languages. Pud, a measure of weight, of Turkic origin. Altın, from the Turkic alti. 6, a 6-kopeck coin. Even the word ruble, may be related to the Arabic rubai, a fourth part. Everyday vocabulary was also actively replenished with Eastern words. Loshad, horse, from the Turkic alasha. Sobaka, dog, also a Turkism, although the Slavic paios also existed in parallel. Karman, pocket, from the Turkic kese, a purse. Sunduk, chest, an Arabic word that came through Turkic languages. Khalat, robe, a Persianism that became a symbol of home attire. Tulip, a Turkic name for a sheepskin coat. Kuşak, a sash, of Turkic origin. Kolpak, a cap, from the Turkic kalpak. And the food vocabulary. Izyum, raisins, from the Turkic yuzum, grape. Arbuz, watermelon, an Arabic word that came through Turkic languages. Morkov, carrot, possibly also an Eastern loanword, though the etymology is disputed. But the most interesting thing is how not only the vocabulary, but the very structure of the language changed. Turkic methods of word formation, syntactic constructions, and even intonational features penetrated Russian speech. For example, the suffix chi in words like kravchi, stryapchi, and lovchi is a calque of the Turkic suffix for professions. The construction de-ka or poidyom-ka may also reflect Turkic influence. And what changes occurred in phonetics? In some dialects, sounds uncharacteristic of Slavic languages appeared. Velar consonants, specific intonation, stress patterns, all these are traces of Eastern influence. But language is only part of the cultural revolution. The material forms of culture also changed: clothing, dwellings, utensils, weapons. The Russian costume of that era was very different from the pre-Mongol one. Eastern elements of cut, new types of fabric, and unusual decorations appeared. Kaftans became longer and more spacious in the Eastern fashion. Women's headdresses acquired characteristic pointed shapes. Men's hats also changed. High kolpaks and fur hats of Eastern cut appeared. Footwear became more diverse, from simple bast shoes to expensive Morocco leather boots of Eastern workmanship. The art of jewelry was particularly strongly influenced by the East. Russian masters learned the fine techniques of Eastern filigree, granulation, and enamel. New forms of jewelry appeared: pendant earrings, bracelets with complex ornaments, rings with Eastern inscriptions. Weaponry was also enriched with Eastern technologies. Russian masters learned to make Damascus steel, mastered Eastern methods of decorating blades, and adopted the forms of Eastern weapons. Architecture changed less noticeably, but even here, Eastern influences were apparent. Elements borrowed from Muslim art appeared in the decoration of churches. Secular buildings began to be influenced by Eastern principles of layout. And what about culinary traditions? Russian cuisine was enriched with many Eastern dishes and cooking methods. Plov, manti, shurpa. These dishes became common on the Russian table, although they were called by different names. Methods of preparing meat, especially horse meat and lamb, came from the steppe. Fermented milk products like kumis and katik also became known to the Russians. Even methods of baking bread changed under Eastern influence. Beverages also became more diverse. Eastern types of kvass, new types of honey drinks, and herbal infusions based on steppe recipes appeared. Tea had not yet arrived, but its predecessors, various hot infusions, were already known. Musical culture was deeply influenced by the East. The drawn-out Russian songs largely originate from steppe melodies. Rhythmic features, melodic turns, vocal techniques, all these bear traces of the Turkic heritage. Musical instruments were also supplemented with Eastern models. The domra, balalaika, and gusli changed their form under Eastern influence. New instruments appeared: tambourines, kettle drums, and wind instruments of the Eastern type. Dance culture became more diverse. Eastern-style dances were added to the traditional Slavic round dances. Men's warrior dances acquired step dash and daring. The folklore tradition was also transformed. Eastern plots and images penetrated Russian fairy tales. Ivan Tsarevich could turn into an Eastern prince, Baba Yaga into a steppe witch, and the Grey Wolf into a steppe horse tulpar. The Bylina epic acquired new features. Bogatyrs began to fight not only with Pechenegs and Polovtsians, but also with Tatar Khans. New heroic deeds appeared, related to liberation from the Horde yoke. Proverbs and sayings were also supplemented with Eastern elements. God will not betray, a pig will not eat, possibly a calque of a Turkic proverb. You won't build stone chambers from righteous labors, also reflects Eastern influence. And what was happening with religious beliefs? Formally, Ruses remained Orthodox, but elements of Eastern beliefs penetrated popular orthodoxy. The cult of the sky, characteristic of Tengrism, merged with the Orthodox veneration of heavenly powers. The veneration of ancestors acquired new forms similar to steppe traditions. Ideas about nature spirits were enriched with Eastern demonology. Even in church art, Eastern motifs appeared. Iconography was influenced by Eastern artistic traditions. The ornamentation of manuscripts acquired Eastern features. Calendar rituals became more complex. Echoes of Eastern festivities were added to Christian holidays. Maslenitsa acquired some features of Novruz. Ivan Kupala Day merged with the summer festivals of the steppe peoples. Family rituals also changed. Wedding ceremonies included elements of Eastern marriage customs. Funeral rites acquired new features related to Eastern ideas about the afterlife. And how did the mentality, the psychology of the Russian person change? Here the changes were particularly deep, though less noticeable. The Russian person became more open to other cultures. Pre-Mongol Ruses was a rather closed civilization oriented towards Byzantium and Western Europe. After the Mongol invasion, horizons expanded. The Russians learned about Asia, about distant countries, about other ways of life. This did not mean a loss of patriotism or Orthodox identity. On the contrary, contact with another civilization sharpened the sense of one's own uniqueness. But at the same time, an ability to understand and appreciate what was foreign appeared. Political culture also changed. The Vesh traditions gradually gave way to an authoritarian model of power borrowed from the East. The concept of the divine nature of royal power, of unquestioning obedience to the sovereign, all this came from Horde traditions. But here, too, it was not a simple borrowing but a complex synthesis. Eastern despotism combined with Byzantine ideas about royal power, creating a special Russian model of autocracy. Military psychology acquired new features: Eastern cunning, steppe mobility, and the ability to fight in any conditions were added to traditional Slavic bravery. The Russian warrior became more universal, capable of fighting in an open field, during a siege, in the forest, and in the steppe. The commercial mentality also changed. Russian merchants adopted many business practices from their Eastern colleagues, methods of organizing caravan trade, and financial transaction methods. New forms of commercial law, credit relations, and partnerships appeared. And how did attitudes towards family, women, and children change? Here, too, interesting changes took place. The Eastern model of a patriarchal family in some ways coincided with the Slavic one, but in some ways it was different. A woman in a mixed Russo-Tatar family could have more rights than in a purely Slavic one. Steppe traditions granted women a certain independence, the right to participate in economic decisions, and even the right to divorce in exceptional cases. The upbringing of children also acquired new features. Elements of Eastern pedagogy were added to the traditional Orthodox upbringing, more attention to physical development, martial skills, and the ability to ride a horse. The attitude towards education became more pragmatic. Whereas before education was mainly ecclesiastical, now there was a need for practical knowledge, languages, arithmetic, commercial skills, diplomacy. Gradually, a new type of Russian person was formed, more flexible, more open to the world, more capable of adaptation. This person could feel equally at home in a Russian terem, a steppe tent, and an Eastern palace. He spoke several languages, understood different cultures, and could find common ground with people of the most varied nationalities. At the same time, he remained Russian, Orthodox, but his Russianness became more complex, more multi-layered. By the end of the 15th century, these changes had encompassed all of Russian society. From the peasant to the boyar, from the artisan to the prince, everyone carried traces of the great cultural mixing. And this mixing did not weaken Russian culture, but, on the contrary, enriched it, made it more viable, more adapted to the challenges of the time. The Ruses that emerged from under the Horde yoke was not at all the same Ruses that had entered it in the 13th century. Political transformation, from veche to autocracy. Imagine a Novgorodian veche square at the end of the 12th century. Thousands of townspeople have gathered to discuss important matters. A din of voices hangs over the square. They argue, shout, wave their arms. Everyone has the right to speak. Everyone can influence the decision. The prince stands aside. He is merely the executor of the popular assembly's will, a servant of the veche, not its master. Now let's jump forward 300 years to the Moscow Kremlin in the time of Ivan III. The Grand Prince sits on his throne, surrounded by boyars who bow respectfully to the ground before him. No one dares to contradict the sovereign. No one can dispute his decision. The prince's word is law. His will is sacred. What happened during these 3 centuries? How did a democratic Ruses turn into an autocratic power? How was the veche bell replaced by the Tsar's mace? The answer is simple. The greatest political revolution in Russian history took place. And the main driving force of this revolution was Eastern influence, the political traditions that came from the steppe with the Mongol conquerors. Before the Mongol invasion, the political system of Rus was a unique phenomenon in the medieval world. It was not a monarchy in its purest form, nor was it a republic. It was a kind of federation of principalities, where the prince's power was limited by veche traditions, boyar duma, and church influence. The prince was primarily a military leader and a judge. He defended the land from enemies, resolved disputes among his subjects, and ensured compliance with the laws. But the most important decisions, on war and peace, on taxes, on the choice of the prince himself, were made collectively at the veche or the boyar duma. This system worked well in conditions of relative stability. The princes competed with each other, but according to certain rules. The boyars influenced politics, but within the framework of tradition. The people participated in governance, but through age-old institutions. The Mongol invasion destroyed this system to its foundations, not immediately, not suddenly, but inevitably, because the steppe conquerors brought with them a completely different political culture, despotic, hierarchical, based on unquestioning submission to supreme authority. In the Mongol tradition, the Khan was not just a military leader or the first among equals. He was the anointed of the eternal blue sky, a sacred figure endowed with divine authority. His will was not discussed or disputed. It was executed immediately and unconditionally. This sacralization of power was a revolution for the Russian consciousness. Pre-Mongol princes, even the most powerful ones, remained men among men. They could be criticized, argued with, and even expelled if they did not suit their subjects. The Mongol Khan was a fundamentally different being. He stood immeasurably above all other people, a mediator between the earthly and heavenly worlds. To criticize him was not just dangerous, it was blasphemous, an encroachment on the divine order. The Russian princes, who received yarliks for their principalities in the Horde, willy-nilly absorbed this new political culture. They saw how power was structured among the conquerors, understood its effectiveness, and gradually adopted its principles. It began as forced mimicry. Before the Horde Khans, they had to appear as submissive vassals, as executive servants. But gradually, external submission turned into an internal conviction. The princes began to believe that this was exactly how power should be structured. Alexander Nevsky was still a prince of the old type. He consulted with the boyars, considered the decisions of the Vetch, and remained a servant of his land. But his descendants began to change. They convened the Vetch less often, listened to the boyars less, and relied more on their own will. The Moscow princes brought this process to its logical conclusion. Ivan Kalita, Semyon the Proud, Ivan the Red, all of them, step by step, freed themselves from the traditional limitations of princely power. They ceased to be servants of the land and became its masters. Moscow's special role in the Horde system also contributed to this. The Moscow princes became the main collectors of tribute, the intermediaries between Russes and the Horde. This gave them enormous financial resources and political influence, but at the same time, it distanced them from traditional Russian institutions. The Moscow prince could disregard Vetch traditions. He had the support of the Horde. He could ignore the Boyar Dumas. He had his own service people. He could neglect the opinion of the church. He had allies among the higher clergy. Gradually, a new model of power was formed, autocratic, hierarchical, based on personal loyalty to the sovereign. This model combined Eastern despotic traditions with Byzantine ideas about the sanctity of royal power. The administrative system was also restructured along Eastern lines. New posts and titles appeared, copied from those of the Horde. Diak, clerk, from the Arabic dia, scribe. Podyachi, assistant to the Diak. Dvoretsky, major domo, manager of the prince's court. A calque of the Horde's Saraichi. These positions were not elective, like the ancient Russian Tisiatskis or Posadniks. They were appointed by the prince and depended solely on his will. A professional bureaucracy was created, loyal to the sovereign personally, not to the land or tradition. The tax system was completely rebuilt on the Mongol model. Instead of the voluntary polyudi, a compulsory tribute was introduced. Regular taxes, unknown in pre-Mongol Rus, appeared. A centralized apparatus for tax collection was created. The word podat, tax, itself is symbolic. It comes from podavat, meaning to give voluntarily. But in practice, taxes became compulsory, collected by force, and enforced with harsh penalties. The state transformed from a protector of its subjects into their exploiter. The judicial system also changed radically. Ancient Russian law was based on custom, tradition, and collective discussion of disputed issues. Mongol law, the Yasa of Genghis Khan, was a written code that allowed for no interpretation or exceptions. Russian princes began to create their own law codes based on Eastern principles. New types of punishment appeared: public execution in the marketplace, flogging with a knout, amputation of limbs. All of this was borrowed from Horde practice. The principle of talion, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, began to prevail over the ancient principle of compensating for damages. Revenge was elevated to the rank of state policy. Cruelty became an instrument of power. Military organization was restructured along step lines. The Druzhina system, based on personal ties between the prince and his warriors, gave way to the Pomesty army. Service people received land not as property, but for temporary use, depending on their service. This radically changed the relationships within the military class. A Druzhinik was a companion in arms to the prince, could argue with him, give advice, and even leave for another prince. A Pomeshchik was a servant of the sovereign, obliged to carry out his orders without question. The tactics of battle also changed. Eastern elements were added to traditional Slavic techniques, light cavalry, archery, feigned retreats. Russian warriors learned to fight in the steppe style. And what was happening with the church in these conditions? The Orthodox clergy found themselves in a difficult position. On the one hand, the Mongols showed religious tolerance, did not interfere with church life, and even patronized monasteries. On the other hand, the political changes could not but affect the ecclesiastical sphere. Gradually, the church became an ally of the centralizing power. The higher clergy supported the Moscow princes, blessed their policies, and helped them in their struggle with rivals. In return, the church received privileges, lands, and protection from the state. A symphony of powers was formed, secular and spiritual, state and church. This model also had Eastern roots. In Byzantium, the church was an ally of the emperor. In Muslim countries, of the caliph or sultan. Now, a similar system was taking shape in Rus. Church hierarchs began to think in state terms. They blessed wars, supported diplomatic actions, and participated in political intrigues. Spiritual power merged with secular power. The ideas about the nature of princely power also changed. Whereas before the prince was considered the choice of the people or the boyars, now he became God's anointed. His power was sanctified not by human choice, but by divine destiny. This sacralization of power had deep roots in Eastern tradition. Mongol Khans were considered the chosen of Tengri, Muslim caliphs the vicars of Allah, and Byzantine emperors the images of Christ on earth. Russian princes adopted similar ideas. Gradually, the ideology of autocracy was formed. The sovereign's power was declared unlimited, indivisible, and inalienable. He was the sole source of laws, the sole judge of his subjects, the sole master of their fates. This ideology was reflected in official documents, chronicles, and church sermons. A whole system of justifications for absolute power was created, historical, religious, and legal. Diplomatic practice also changed under Eastern influence. Russian princes adopted the Horde's forms of conducting negotiations, methods of drawing up treaties, and diplomatic etiquette. New diplomatic institutions appeared, permanent embassies, professional interpreters, special diplomatic services. All this was borrowed from Eastern practice, where diplomacy had been developing for centuries. The character of international relations also changed. Whereas pre-Mongol princes conducted diplomacy on an equal footing, as sovereigns with sovereigns, now a hierarchical system of relations was formed. The Moscow princes recognized themselves as vassals of the Horde Khans, but demanded vassal dependence from other Russian princes. This system of vassalage also had Eastern roots. In the Mongol Empire, all rulers except the great Khan were considered his vassals, received investiture from him, and owed him service and tribute. Russian princes adapted this system to local conditions. They created their own hierarchies of vassalage, where everyone knew their place, everyone was subordinate to someone and commanded someone. And what was happening with urban self-government? Here the changes were particularly painful. The Veche traditions, which formed the basis of urban life, gradually died out under the pressure of the centralizing power. The Moscow princes did not tolerate independent urban communities. They stripped cities of their traditional privileges, appointed their own governors, and subordinated urban life to the princely administration. Novgorod resisted this process the longest. The Novgorod Republic retained its freedoms until the end of the 15th century. But even here, the grand princely power gradually prevailed over the Vetch traditions. The fall of Novgorod in the year 1478 symbolized the end of the ancient Russian political system. The Vetch bell was taken down and transported to Moscow. Instead of a popular assembly, the city began to be governed by Moscow's appointees. Pskov held out for a few more decades, but its fate was also predetermined. By the beginning of the 16th century, all Russian lands were under the rule of the Moscow autocrat. This process was not a simple conquest. It was a profound political transformation that changed the very nature of power in Rus. The federal system was replaced by a unitary one, democratic elements by authoritarian ones, and collective decisions by autocratic ones. The new political system proved to be very effective. It allowed for the unification of the scattered Russian lands, the creation of a powerful centralized state, and successful resistance to external enemies. But the price was high. Russian society lost its democratic traditions, its skills of self-government, its capacity for political dialogue. A type of subject was formed, accustomed to obedience, incapable of independent political decisions. These changes proved to be irreversible. Even after the overthrow of the Horde yoke, the new political system not only survived, but was strengthened. The Moscow sovereigns continued the policy begun during the Horde era. Ivan III, the liberator of Russes from Horde dependence, was also the creator of Russian autocracy. He completed the process of centralization begun by his ancestors under the influence of Eastern traditions. Vasily III brought this line to its logical conclusion. Under his rule, the last elements of the federal structure, the last islands of urban self-government, and the last limitations on the grand princely power disappeared. Ivan the Terrible was already a full-fledged autocrat of the Eastern type. His Oprichnina, his terror, his ideas about power, all had deep roots in the Horde era, in the political upheaval that occurred in the 13th through 15th centuries. Thus, Eastern influence changed not only the ethnic composition and culture of the Russian people, but also the political system of the Russian state. The democratic Ruses of pre-Mongol times turned into the authoritarian Russia of the Tsardom of Moscow. This process had far-reaching consequences. The authoritarian traditions that formed during the Horde era determined the development of Russian statehood for many centuries to come. From Ivan the Terrible to Peter the Great, from Catherine II to Nicholas I, all were heirs to the political revolution that took place under the influence of the East. Economic changes, trade and crafts, a Moscow market in the mid-14th century. It's early morning, but the square is already full of people. Merchants are setting up their stalls, laying out their goods, and calling out to customers. And what goods? Here you can see things that pre-Mongol Russes never dreamed of. Here a Tatar merchant sells silk from distant China, spices from India, precious stones from Central Asia. Next to him, an Armenian trader is selling carpets, silver, and Eastern fabrics. And here is a Russian guest, just returned from the Horde, laying out leather goods, furs, and saddles of exquisite Eastern craftsmanship. The customers are also diverse: Russian boyars in rich kaftans, Tatar murzas in silk robes, Italian merchants in foreign attire, Horde ambassadors with a large retinue, and everyone is paying with silver coins bearing Arabic inscriptions, weighing goods on Eastern steelyards, and calculating profits on Chinese abacuses. This is the new economy of Rus, an economy that was radically transformed in a century and a half under the influence of the East. an economy that turned from closed and patriarchal to open and international. And the main driving force behind these changes was the inclusion of the Russian lands into the vast trade network of the Mongol Empire. Before the Mongol invasion, the economy of Russes was quite simple and traditional. The basis was a natural economy. Each family, each community tried to provide itself with everything necessary. Trade existed but was limited, mainly to luxury goods for the nobility and goods that could not be produced locally. Monetary circulation was also poorly developed. Transactions were conducted mainly in furs, marten, sable, squirrel pelts. Silver grivnas were used rarely, only in large deals. Credit, banking operations, and complex financial instruments were practically unknown. Crafts also remained quite primitive. Local artisans knew how to make everything necessary for daily life: pottery, clothing, simple jewelry, weapons. But high-quality goods, complex technologies, and expensive materials remained a rarity. The Mongol conquest turned this picture upside down. The Russian lands became part of a gigantic trade empire stretching from Korea to Hungary. Caravan routes connecting Europe with Asia, the North with the South, and the Christian world with the Muslim world passed through this territory. The Great Silk Road, which had previously bypassed Russes, now ran through its territory. Russian cities, Moscow, Tver, Nizhny Novgorod, Ryazan, became important trade centers on this route. Streams of goods, money, people, and ideas flowed through them. But most importantly, the very philosophy of economic activity changed. Whereas before the goal was to feed one's family and community, now the idea of accumulation, profit, and investment appeared. Russian merchants learned to think not only about today, but also about tomorrow, not only about their own needs, but also about market opportunities. This new philosophy came from the East. For centuries, Muslim traders had developed complex commercial practices, created international trading houses, and invented financial instruments. Now, this knowledge became available to Russian entrepreneurs as well. The monetary system changed radically. Instead of furs and silver ingots, coins came into circulation, first Horde coins, then Russian ones. New monetary units appeared: the altin, the denga, the polushka. The term dengi, money, itself came from the Turkic language, from the word tenge. But it was not just about the names. The principles of monetary circulation changed. Whereas before silver was valued mainly by weight, now nominal money appeared, the value of which was guaranteed by the authority of the ruler who issued it. Credit relations received a powerful impetus for development. Eastern merchants brought with them developed forms of trade credit, bills of exchange, and banking operations. Russian traders quickly mastered these innovations and began to use them in their own practice. Professional moneylenders, money changers, and bankers appeared. Many of them were foreigners: Armenians, Jews, Italians. But gradually, Russians also mastered these professions. By the 15th century, real banking houses existed in major trading cities, capable of conducting complex financial operations. The tax system was also completely restructured. The Horde's principles of taxation proved to be much more effective than the ancient Russian ones. Instead of the irregular polyudi, a permanent tribute was introduced, collected by professional officials. New types of taxes and duties appeared: trade duties, travel duties, bridge tolls, ferry tolls. This entire system was borrowed from Horde practice. The word poshlina, duty, itself is of Eastern origin, from the Arabic poshel, a tax. These changes stimulated the development of commodity-money relations. To pay the tribute, money was needed. To get money, one had to sell something. To sell, one had to produce. Thus, the natural economy gradually gave way to a market economy. The yam service, created on the Mongol model, revolutionized transport and communication. The system of postal stations made it possible to speed up the delivery of goods and correspondence, making trade operations more efficient and reliable. Russian merchants gained the opportunity to trade over vast distances. A Moscow guest could send goods to Kaffa or Astrakhan, make a profit there, and invest it in a new deal. Such a speed of capital turnover was unthinkable in pre-Mongol times. The range of goods expanded incredibly. Eastern goods flooded the Russian markets: silks, brocades, spices, jewelry, weapons, carpets. Russian masters became acquainted with new materials, new technologies, and new designs. Chinese silk, Indian spices, Persian carpets, Damascus steel, all became available to the Russian consumer. Of course, mainly to the wealthy consumer, but gradually Eastern goods penetrated the middle classes of society as well. And what did Russian merchants export to the East? Traditional goods: furs, honey, wax, leather. But new ones were added: grain, flax, hemp, artisan products. Russian goods were in demand in the Horde. They were transported to Central Asia, the Black Sea region, and even to China. Furs remained the main export commodity of Rus. Sables, ermines, martens, beavers, these furs were highly valued in Eastern markets. Russian trappers developed new hunting grounds and improved methods of trapping and processing furs. But completely new export industries also appeared. Russian flax, for example, turned out to be in great demand in southern countries where there was no native flax cultivation. Russian hemp was used to make ropes and sails in maritime countries. Honey and wax also found new markets. In Muslim countries, where winemaking was forbidden, Russian honey was used to make alcoholic beverages. Wax was used to make candles for numerous churches and mosques. Craft production received a powerful stimulus for development. Eastern masters who settled in Russian cities brought with them new technologies, new work techniques, and new quality standards. Metallurgy was enriched with Eastern methods of smelting and processing iron. Russian blacksmiths learned to make Damascus steel and mastered fine techniques of hardening and tempering. New types of weapons appeared: sabers, daggers, and armor of the Eastern type. The art of jewelry was particularly strongly influenced by the East. Russian goldsmiths mastered the techniques of granulation, filigree, and cloisonné enamel. New forms of jewelry, new ways of processing precious stones and metals appeared. Ceramic production also changed. Eastern potters taught Russian masters to make fine ceramics, apply colored glazes, and create complex decorative compositions. Textile production gained access to new materials and technologies. Silk threads brought from the East made it possible to create luxurious fabrics for the nobility. New dyeing methods made it possible to obtain bright, stable colors. The leather industry was enriched with Eastern techniques of tanning and processing hides. Russian shoemakers learned to make fine Morocco leather goods, colored leather, and artistic embossing. Woodworking crafts also experienced Eastern influence. New methods of carving, inlay, and varnishing appeared. Russian carpenters mastered the production of Eastern-style furniture and decorative items with complex ornamentation. And what became of the artisans themselves? Their social status changed radically. In pre-Mongol times, an artisan was primarily a member of a community, worked mainly for local needs, and rarely went beyond traditional technologies. Now, the artisan became a commodity producer, working for a wide market. He had to consider demand, follow fashion, and compete with his colleagues. This required new qualities: enterprise, ingenuity, and commercial acumen. Many artisans also became traders. They not only produced goods, but also sold them themselves, traveled to fairs, and established connections with customers. The line between artisan and merchant was blurring. Craft dynasties appeared, passing down the secrets of their craft from generation to generation. But now these secrets were not only technical, but also commercial. A father taught his son not only how to make a good product, but also how to sell it profitably. The guild organization, characteristic of Western Europe, did not become widespread in Rus. Instead, other forms of artisan associations were formed, artels, partnerships, and trading companies of the Eastern type. These associations allowed small producers to compete with large workshops, gain access to expensive raw materials, and develop new markets. They combined the principles of mutual aid and competition, tradition, and innovation. Agriculture also felt the influence of the new economic relations. Tribute had to be paid in money or silver, and this forced peasants to produce marketable products. New agricultural crops brought from the east appeared. Buckwheat, millet, and some types of vegetables enriched the diet of the Russian peasant. New livestock breeds improved animal husbandry, but most importantly, the attitude towards the land changed. Whereas before the land was a provider that had to be cared for and cherished, now it became a source of income that could be increased through the intensification of production. The Pomesty landholding system, which developed under the influence of Eastern traditions of conditional tenure, stimulated the development of commercial agriculture. The pomeshchik was interested in receiving a monetary rent from the peasants, and the peasants were interested in producing marketable products. Fair trade acquired special importance in the new economic conditions. Fairs became not just a place of trade, but also centers of economic information, credit operations, and international contacts. The largest fairs, Makarievskaya, Sviajskaya, Tikvinskaya, gathered merchants from all over Ruses and from foreign countries. Deals for huge sums were concluded here, trade connections were established, and news and technologies were spread. Market prices for basic goods were established at the fairs. This information quickly spread throughout the country thanks to a developed system of trade links. The Russian market was becoming a single economic space. Specialized trading cities appeared, which lived mainly on intermediary activities. Nizhny Novgorod, located at the confluence of the Volga and Oka rivers, became a center of trade between the north and south, west and east. International trade became regular. Russian merchants were constantly present in Kaffa, Azov, Astrakhan, and other trading centers. Foreign traders had permanent representative offices in Moscow, Novgorod, and other Russian cities. Trade agreements became an important instrument of diplomacy. The Moscow princes concluded agreements with the Horde Khans, Genoese colonies, and Hanseatic cities, not only on political issues, but also on trade privileges. By the end of the 15th century, the economy of Ruses had changed radically. From a natural economy, it had turned into a commodity money economy. From a closed system, it had become part of the world market. From traditional, it had become dynamically developing. These changes had far-reaching consequences. The new economy required new people, enterprising, educated, capable of risk and innovation. It created new social strata, merchants, a trading nobility, and industrialists. It changed the mentality of society. The ideals of asceticism and contentment with little gave way to the pursuit of success and wealth. Traditional values were combined with new ideas about the goals and meaning of life. The Eastern influence in the economic sphere turned out to be particularly deep and long-lasting. Many institutions created during the Horde era existed for centuries. Many traditions established then determined the development of the Russian economy right up to modern times. Religious syncretism, orthodoxy and Tengrism, a quiet evening in a Russian village in the 14th century. The entire large family is gathered in their izba. The head of the household is a Russian peasant, but his wife is from a Tatar family and has converted to Orthodoxy. In the front corner stand Orthodox icons: the Savior, the Mother of God, Nicholas the Wonder Worker. But next to them, slightly aside, hides a small silver idol, an ancient amulet of his wife's clan. They pray before the icons in the Orthodox way, making the sign of the cross and bowing. But when the conversation turns to an upcoming journey or an important matter, the wife quietly touches her amulet, whispers something in a Turkic language, appealing to the spirits of her ancestors for protection and good fortune. The children grow up in this dual faith, seeing no contradiction in it. In the morning, they go to church, listen to the Orthodox service, and receive Holy Communion. In the evening, their grandmother tells them stories about celestial spirits, about the great Tengri, about how the souls of their ancestors protect their clan. And no one finds this strange or sinful. Such is life in the new Russia, where ancient Slavic beliefs have intertwined with Orthodox Christianity, and now steppe religions, Islam, Tengrism, shamanism, have been added to this fusion. This is the amazing story of religious syncretism in the era of the Golden Horde, a story of how different faiths did not fight each other but slowly, cautiously drew closer, creating unique forms of popular religiosity. To begin with, the Mongol conquerors brought with them a religious tolerance unique to the medieval world. This was not indifference to faith, but a conscious policy. Genghis Khan and his heirs understood that to rule a vast empire inhabited by dozens of peoples, one could not impose a single religion on everyone. The Yasa of Genghis Khan directly prescribed respect for all religions, giving preference to none. The Mongol Khans patronized Christian churches, Buddhist monasteries, Muslim mosques, and pagan shrines. The main thing was that the clergy of any religion prayed for the health of the Khan and the prosperity of the empire. This policy was radically different from what was happening in other parts of the medieval world. In Western Europe, dissenters were burned at the stake. In Byzantium, heretics were persecuted. In Muslim countries, people were forced to convert to Islam. The Mongol Empire was an island of religious freedom in an ocean of religious fanaticism. For Russian Orthodoxy, this situation turned out to be unexpectedly favorable. The Church not only did not suffer from the conquest, but was even strengthened. The Horde Khans exempted monasteries from taxes, gave them lands, and protected them from local authorities. Why did this happen? The Mongols were practical people. They understood that the Orthodox Church was a powerful force capable of influencing the mood of the Russian population. It was better to make it an ally than an enemy. Moreover, many Mongol military leaders were Christians, Nestorians, who knew Christian doctrine and saw the Orthodox as fellow believers. But most importantly, the Mongol religious philosophy was surprisingly compatible with Christianity. Tengrism, the main religion of the steppe peoples, did not deny the existence of other gods. On the contrary, it recognized that each nation could have its own patrons, its own celestial protectors. Tengri, the eternal blue sky, was perceived not as the only god, but as a supreme deity standing above all others. Under his authority, the Christian God, the Muslim Allah, and the Buddhist Buddha could all operate. They were all manifestations of a single celestial power. This understanding allowed the Mongol nobility to easily switch from one religion to another without experiencing internal conflict. A Mongol Khan could pray to Tengri in the morning, listen to a Christian sermon at noon, and participate in a Muslim prayer in the evening, and see all of this as service to the one sky. Russian Orthodoxy, finding itself in such an environment, also began to change. Not in its dogma, the basic Christian truths remained unshakable, but in its practice, in popular beliefs, in everyday religiosity. The cult of the sky, central to Tengrism, found its reflection in the Orthodox tradition. The heavenly powers began to be perceived not only as angelic ranks, but also as manifestations of the divine will in nature. The sky became a special place of divine presence. The veneration of ancestors, characteristic of all steppe religions, also penetrated the Orthodox environment. Of course, the official church taught to pray to saints, not to pagan ancestors. But in the popular consciousness, the line between saints and ancestors was often blurred. Saints began to be perceived as heavenly patrons of a clan, a family, a profession. They were addressed not only with prayers for the salvation of the soul, but also with requests for practical help, a good harvest, health, success in business. This was very close to the steppe tradition of venerating ancestral spirits. Ideas about nature spirits were also enriched by Eastern influences. Steppe spirits, patrons of herds, guardians of roads, spirits of sacred places, were added to the traditional Slavic domovoi, leshi, and vodyanoi. These spirits were not opposed to Christian teaching, but were integrated into the Christian worldview. They were perceived as angels of a lower rank, as divine forces acting in the material world by the will of the Almighty. Shamanic practices also found their place in popular orthodoxy. Of course, one could not openly practice shamanism. The church condemned it. But elements of shamanic rituals penetrated folk festivals, healing practices, and magical rituals. Folk healing, widespread in Rus, was enriched with steppe healing techniques. Herbs, incantations, ritual actions, all this was mixed, creating a syncretic system of folk medicine. And what happened with the calendar holidays? Here, syncretism was particularly evident. Christian holidays were superimposed on ancient Slavic ones, and to them were added steppe festivities. Christmas merged with the winter solstice and steppe festivals of renewal. Easter combined with spring rites and the celebration of Nowruz, the Turkic New Year. Trinity Sunday united with summer fertility festivals and steppe rituals of venerating nature. These holidays became surprisingly rich and multi-layered. They intertwined Christian prayers and pagan incantations, church hymns and steppe melodies, Orthodox rites, and Tengrian rituals. The wedding ceremonies in mixed families were particularly interesting. Formally, the wedding took place according to the Orthodox rite. This was required by the church. But elements of steppe wedding traditions were added to the church ceremony. The bride might wear not only a Russian kokoshnik, but also a Tatar kalfak. The groom might wear not only a Russian shirt, but also a steppe robe. On the wedding table were both Russian kalashis and Tatar baursaks. Both Russian songs and Turkic melodies were sung. The children of such marriages were raised in a surprisingly rich religious environment. They knew both Orthodox prayers and steppe incantations. They revered both Christian saints and ancestral spirits. They observed both church fasts and steppe purification rites. Such an upbringing did not make them atheists or religious eclectics. On the contrary, it developed in them a special religious sense, deep, multifaceted, and open to different manifestations of the sacred. Monastic life also experienced Eastern influences, although to a lesser extent. People of steppe origin, who brought with them elements of Eastern mysticism, sometimes took monastic vows. Hesychasm, a mystical movement in Orthodoxy, developed partly under the influence of Sufi practices. Meditation techniques, breathing exercises, methods of achieving mystical union with God, much of this resonated with Eastern spirituality. Of course, the church hierarchy was wary of religious syncretism. Pagan remnants, magical practices, and dual faith were officially condemned. But in practice, the church was forced to tolerate popular traditions, even if they did not fully correspond to Orthodox orthodoxy. Moreover, the church itself sometimes used syncretic forms. for more successful preaching among the mixed population. Christian saints were endowed with the functions of pagan deities, church holidays were combined with folk ones, and Orthodox symbolism was intertwined with traditional ornaments. Saint Nicholas, for example, came to be perceived not only as a Christian saint, but also as the patron of travelers, merchants, and all who wander the roads. This was very much in tune with the steppe ideas about patron deities of caravans. The Mother of God acquired the features of the Great Mother, characteristic of many ancient religions. She was revered not only as the Mother of God, but also as the intercessor for all mothers, the patroness of the family hearth, the guardian of the clan. In the popular consciousness, the Archangel Michael merged with ancient ideas of a celestial warrior, a fighter against the forces of evil. His depictions acquired features characteristic of steppe depictions of divine warriors. And what happened with iconography? Here, Eastern influences were particularly evident. Russian iconography was enriched with new subjects, new compositions, and new artistic techniques. The ornamentation of icons was influenced by Eastern decorative traditions. Floral motifs, geometric patterns, color combinations, much was borrowed from Muslim and steppe art. Even in the depiction of saints, new features appeared. The faces acquired an Eastern spirituality, the poses a steppe majesty, and the clothing elements of Eastern costume. Orthodox iconography was enriched without losing its Christian essence. Church architecture also experienced Eastern influences, although to a lesser extent. Elements borrowed from Muslim ornamentation appeared in the decoration of churches. Domes acquired more graceful forms, and portals received rich adornment. But the most interesting changes occurred in popular religiosity. Here, syncretism reached astonishing forms. Orthodox prayers were read in Church Slavonic, but incantations in Turkic dialects were added to them. Icons were placed next to amulets, crosses were worn together with charms, and Christian holidays were supplemented with pagan rituals. And all of this was perceived not as a contradiction, but as a manifestation of a unified religious life. Syncretism was particularly evident in funeral rites. Officially, burials were conducted according to the Orthodox rite, with a funeral service, prayers, and Christian hymns. But elements of ancient Slavic and steppe traditions were added to this. Not only crosses and icons were placed in the grave, but also amulets, charms, and items that were supposed to help the soul in the afterlife. Funeral feasts combined Christian prayers with pagan triznas, church food with ritual dishes. Ideas about the afterlife also became more complex. Steppe ideas about the world of spirits, the transmigration of souls, and the connection between the living and the dead were added to the Christian doctrine of heaven and hell. Memorial days turned into complex rituals where Christian prayers were combined with pagan incantations, where not only saints but also ancestors were commemorated, where not only God but also spirits were addressed. By the end of the 15th century, religious syncretism had become an organic part of Russian spiritual life. It did not destroy orthodoxy, but enriched it, made it more flexible, more capable of responding to the diverse spiritual needs of the people. This syncretism was not a superficial mixture of different traditions. It was a deep process of interpenetration of different religious systems, creating new forms of spirituality. A Russian person of that era could be sincerely Orthodox and at the same time revere the spirits of his ancestors. He could pray to Christian saints and at the same time believe in the power of amulets. He could observe church fasts and at the same time participate in pagan rituals. This complex religiosity was not the result of ignorance or superstition. It was an attempt to find answers to all the questions of existence, to use all available spiritual resources to create a holistic worldview. In this system, orthodoxy remained the core, the foundation of spiritual life. But elements of other traditions were added to this foundation, creating a rich, multicolored spiritual culture. This kind of religiosity proved to be surprisingly viable. It survived in the popular environment for many centuries, outlasted all attempts at unification and standardization, and has come down to our time in the form of numerous customs and beliefs. The legacy, how the Mongol trace, manifests today. Imagine a modern Russian family at the dinner table. The father is an engineer from Ryazan, the mother is a teacher from Kazan, and the children attend a Moscow school. A typical 21st century family. But look closer. The father is telling the children a fairy tale about Ivan Tsarevich and the gray wolf. But why is the horse in the fairy tale called a wolf? Because the Turkic word buri means both wolf and horse. The mother is cooking pelmeni, a dish that came to us from the vast expanses of Siberia, where Russian cuisine mixed with Asian cuisine. The children are playing a computer game about bogatirs, and these bogatirs look more like steppe batirs than Slavic vityazis. And then the whole family gets into the car and drives to Grandma's house. On the way, they pass through the village of Mamonovo, then through the village of Tatarskoye, past the Ordinka River. And no one stops to think that all these names are a living memory of the great mixing that occurred 7 centuries ago. This is the legacy of the Mongol era in modern Russia. It is everywhere, in our genes and in our words, in our traditions, and in our ideas about the world. We may not notice it, we may not think about it, but it is an integral part of what we call Russianness. Let's start with the most obvious, genetics. Modern DNA studies confirm what we have discussed in the previous chapters. The gene pool of the Russian people indeed carries a significant share of Eastern components. Among the inhabitants of the southern regions of Russia, the Voronezh, Tambov, and Ryazan oblasts, the Mongoloid admixture reaches 15 to 20%. This does not mean that 1 in 5 Russians there is a descendant of the Mongols. It means that practically every family has distant ancestors of steppe origin. In the Volga region, this admixture is even higher. In Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and Chuvashia, live peoples who are the result of centuries of mixing of Turkic, Finno-Ugric, and Slavic components. They cannot be called purely Turkic or purely Slavic. They are new ethnic communities born of the great mixing. But it's not just about percentages and statistics. What is more important is that this mixing created a special anthropological type, characteristic of Russia. The Russian person is different from both the Western European and the East Asian types. He occupies an intermediate position, combining features of different races and peoples. This intermediate position is not accidental. Russia is geographically located between Europe and Asia, between the Christian and Muslim worlds, between settled and nomadic civilizations, and the Russian people have become a living embodiment of this borderland position. Look at the faces of people in the Moscow metro, on a street in Novosibirsk, in a Kazan theater. You will see an amazing variety of types, from purely Slavic to clearly Asian, from northern to southern, and all of them are Russians, all of them are heirs of that great mixing. Now, listen to Russian speech. It contains thousands of words that came from Turkic languages during the Horde era. We say dengi, money, and kazna, treasury, tovar, goods, and bazar, loshad, horse, and sobaka, dog, without suspecting that all these words are witnesses of a long-ago cultural contact. Tulip, sheepskin coat, and kaftan, bashmak, shoe, and karman, pocket, sarai, shed, and ambar, barn. All this everyday vocabulary came from the East. Ataman, chieftain, and Isol, captain, Kazakh, Cossack, and Yamshchik, coachman. The military and administrative terminology is also of Eastern origin. Even such seemingly Russian words as bogatyr and knyaz may have Turkic roots. And as for geographical names, here the Eastern influence is particularly noticeable. Tens of thousands of Russian villages, towns, rivers, and lakes bear Turkic names. Moscow, possibly from a Finno-Ugric root, but through Turkic mediation. Kazan, from the Turkic Kazan, cauldron. Astrakhan, from a Mongol name. Saratov, from the Turkic Sari Tau, yellow mountain. Samara, also of Turkic origin. And these are not archaeological relics. This is living speech. Every day, millions of Russians pronounce words that their ancestors heard from the steppe peoples 7 centuries ago. Every day, they unwittingly reproduce the linguistic heritage of the Golden Horde. And what about Russian cuisine? Here, too, the Eastern influence is enormous. Pelmeni, a Siberian dish that arose from the mixing of Russian and Asian traditions. Blini with fillings, also partly an Eastern borrowing. Many methods of preparing meat came from the steppe. Tea, although it came later in the 17th century, spread along the very routes that were laid during the Horde era. The Russian tea ceremony with a samovar, with jam, with long conversations, this is a synthesis of Russian and Asian traditions of hospitality. Even the Russian banya experienced Eastern influence. Some bath traditions, methods of steaming, and the use of various herbs came from steppe cultures, where baths were also widespread. And what about folk music? The drawn-out Russian songs, their special melodic structure, the manner of performance, much of this has steppe roots. Of course, there are purely Slavic elements, but the Eastern string sounds very distinctly. Chastushkas, for example, are very similar in their rhythmic structure to Turkic takmaks. Dance songs also carry a step daring, a step dash, and instrumental music, the domra, balalaika, garman. All these instruments have Eastern prototypes. Russian folklore is also full of Eastern borrowings. Many fairy tale plots, images, and motifs came from steppe tales. Ivan Tsarevich on the gray wolf, the firebird, the flying carpet. All these images have parallels in the Turkic and Mongol epics. And the Bailinas, Ilya Muromets, Dobrynya Nikitich, Alyosha Popovich. These bogatirs are more like steppe batirs than Western European knights. Their deeds, their weapons, their horses, their opponents, all bear the stamp of Eastern influence. Even Russian proverbs and sayings are full of Eastern borrowings. What's it to us that the Tsar has a headache? A possible calque of a Turkic proverb. One's own shirt is closer to the body, may also have Eastern roots. And what became of the Russian mentality after the Great Mixing? Here the influence of the East is particularly deep, though not always noticeable. Russian collectivism, communality, a tendency towards sobernost. These features are partly inherited from steppe traditions. In nomadic societies, survival depended on cohesion, on mutual assistance, on the ability to act together. These qualities were passed on to the Russian people. Russian patience, the ability to endure hardships, long suffering. This, too, may be a legacy of steppe ancestors. Nomadic life required the ability to adapt to any conditions, to endure deprivation, not to lose heart in difficult times. The Russian breadth of character, the scope, the youthful daring. Here the steppe roots are particularly evident. The boundless expanses of the steppe formed a special type of personality, open, generous, knowing no pettiness, and Russian hospitality. The tradition of welcoming any traveler, sharing one's last piece of bread, not asking a stranger about his business, all this is very characteristic of nomadic peoples. In the steppe, a traveler could always count on help and protection. Even the Russian tendency to philosophize, to ask eternal questions, to search for the meaning of life may have Eastern roots. The steppe peoples have always been distinguished by their contemplative nature, their capacity for deep reflection on the world and man. The political culture of modern Russia also bears traces of the Horde legacy. The traditions of strong power, a vertical chain of command, centralization, all this was formed in the era of the Golden Horde and has survived to our days. The Russian people are accustomed to a strong leader, to charismatic authority, to decisive actions. This does not mean that Russians are incapable of democracy, but it means that their ideas about power were formed under Eastern influence. Bureaucratic traditions also have Horde roots. A complex hierarchy of officials, formal procedures, red tape. Much of this goes back to the Mongol administrative system. And what about religiosity? Modern Russian orthodoxy, of course, is very different from medieval syncretism. But some features of popular religiosity have survived to this day. The veneration of icons as charms, the belief in the power of amulets and talismans, the mixing of Christian and pagan ideas, all this can be found in the modern Russian village and even in the urban environment. This is particularly evident in the attitude towards nature. Russian people still feel a special connection with the land, the forest, the rivers. This is a legacy not only of Slavic paganism, but also of steppe Tengrism, with its cult of nature. And what became of Russian cities after the Great Mixing? Look at Kazan, Astrakhan, Orenburg. These are multinational, multi-confessional centers where Christian churches stand next to Muslim mosques, where Russian architecture is intertwined with Eastern architecture. Even Moscow carries Eastern features within it. The Kremlin with its towers and walls, Red Square with its vastness, St. Basil's Cathedral with its Eastern variegation. All this is the result of a centuries-long synthesis of Western and Eastern traditions. Siberian cities are also unique. They arose as a result of the mixing of Russian colonization with local Asian traditions. Novosibirsk, Krasnoyarsk, Irkutsk. These are not just Russian cities transferred to Asia. They are a new type of settlement, born of the Eurasian synthesis. And what about modern Russian art? Here, too, the Eastern heritage is very noticeable. Russian painting, music, and literature are full of Eastern motifs, images, and moods. Repin and Surikov, Mussorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, Bloch and Yesenin, all of them drew inspiration not only from the Western European, but also from the Eastern tradition. Borodin's Polovtsian dances, Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade, Prokofiev's Scythian suite. All these are fruits of the Eurasian synthesis. Even modern Russian pop culture carries Eastern elements within it. Russian rap, Russian rock, Russian pop music. In all of this, one can find echoes of ancient steppe melodies, ancient rhythms. And what about the modern Russian economy? Here, too, one can find traces of the Horde legacy. Russian entrepreneurship has always been distinguished by its scope, its readiness to take risks, its ability to quickly adapt to new conditions. These qualities were characteristic of the steppe traders who centuries earlier established trade links between Europe and Asia. Modern Russian businessmen in many ways inherit these traditions. The Russian tendency for large-scale projects, for constructions of the century, for the development of new territories, may also have steppe roots. Nomads were always capable of long campaigns, of developing new lands, of grandiose enterprises. And what about modern Russian education? The tradition of multilingualism, the study of Eastern languages and cultures, the interest in Asia. All this is also a legacy of the Horde era. Russia is the only European country where Eastern languages are widely studied in schools, where universities have strong Oriental studies departments, where knowledge of Asian cultures is considered prestigious. This is not accidental. From the very beginning, Russia was formed as a Eurasian power, as a bridge between West and East. And this Eurasianism has deep historical roots. Modern Russian diplomacy also bears the stamp of the Horde legacy. Russia easily finds common ground with Asian countries, understands Eastern logic, and knows how to conduct negotiations in the Eastern style. Russian diplomats in China, India, and the countries of Central Asia feel at home. They understand the local traditions, know how to build relationships, and what arguments will be convincing. And what about the modern Russian army? Here, too, one can find an Eastern heritage. The Russian soldier has always been distinguished by his endurance, his unpretentiousness, his ability to fight in any conditions. These qualities were also characteristic of the steppe warriors. Russian military tactics also combine Western and Eastern elements. The ability for rapid maneuvers, for sudden strikes, for actions in the enemy's rear. All this is a legacy of the steppe military school. Even modern Russian cosmonautics can be seen as a continuation of the ancient tradition of exploring new spaces. It is no accident that the Russians were the first to fly into space. It is in their blood, in their genetic memory. And what have modern Russian families become? Here, too, the Eastern influence is noticeable. Russian families are often multi-generational, including not only parents and children, but also grandparents and other relatives. This tradition of the extended family is characteristic of Eastern cultures. In the Western tradition, the family is usually nuclear, parents and children. In the Eastern tradition, it includes all relatives. The Russian family occupies an intermediate position. The attitude towards elders in the Russian family also has Eastern features. Respect for age, for experience, for the wisdom of the elders. All this is more characteristic of Asian than European cultures. And what about modern Russian sports? Russians have always excelled in sports that require endurance, willpower, and the ability to endure hardships. This is a legacy of their steppe ancestors, for whom physical endurance was a matter of life and death. Russian achievements in hockey, soccer, track and field, wrestling, all this is the result not only of training, but also of a genetic memory passed down from generation to generation. Even modern Russian fashion carries Eastern elements within it. Russian fashion designers often use Eastern motifs, Eastern fabrics, and Eastern silhouettes. This is not imitation, but a manifestation of an internal closeness to Eastern aesthetics. And what is happening in modern Russian regions? Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Yakutia, Tuva. All these republics represent unique cultural syntheses where Russian and local traditions create new forms of civilization. Kazan, the capital of Tatarstan, is a perfect example of such a synthesis. Here, Russian and Tatar cultures do not oppose each other, but complement each other, creating a unique image of the city. The same can be said of the other national republics of Russia. Everywhere, Russian culture interacts with local traditions, creating new, unique forms. This interaction is not an imposition of Russian traditions on other peoples, nor is it the dissolution of Russianness in a foreign environment. It is a creative synthesis that creates a new quality, new opportunities for development. Modern Russia is not a nation-state in the Western sense. It is a civilizational project that unites dozens of peoples, hundreds of cultures, and a multitude of traditions. And the foundation of this project was laid precisely in the era of the Golden Horde. The great mixing of the 13th through 15th centuries created a unique type of civilization, Eurasian, multinational, multi-confessional. This civilization proved to be incredibly viable, capable of development, of exploring new spaces, of creating great cultural values. Today, in the 21st century, Russia remains true to this tradition. It continues to be a bridge between West and East, between Christianity and Islam, between European and Asian civilizations. And in this lies its uniqueness, its historical mission, its contribution to world civilization. Russia is living proof that different peoples and cultures can not only coexist peacefully, but also create something fundamentally new, richer, and more complex than the sum of its parts. The Mongol legacy is not a burden of the past, but a resource for the future. It makes Russia more flexible, more open, more capable of dialogue with different civilizations. In the era of globalization, these qualities become particularly valuable. We are ending our story, but the story itself continues. The great mixing that began 7 centuries ago continues today. Russia still remains a melting pot of cultures, a laboratory of inter-civilizational synthesis.